Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Michigan Engineering DEI lecture. I'm Sarah Pozzi, a professor of nuclear engineering and director of DEI for the College of Engineering. We are committed to engaging our entire community, learning and growing together. The DEI lectures are an important part of our People First Engineering. And it's my pleasure today to introduce today's speaker, David Tarver. David is a lecturer in the Michigan Engineering Center for Entrepreneurship and founder and board president of the Urban Entrepreneurship Initiative. He's a highly successful technology executive. David enjoys investing in groundbreaking startup companies, advising and supporting entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship programs, and speaking to various groups about entrepreneurship and business development. David holds a bachelor's and master's degrees in electrical engineering from the University of Michigan. In 2012, David published the book Proving Ground, a memoir, which details his entrepreneurial journey from childhood dream to international success. So please join me in welcoming David Tarver. David, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much. Let's see. I would like to share my screen with you because I have a lot of pictures to share. So I'm throwing that up there. And you can let me know if that's showing up.
We see the screen. We need the slide now.
Oh, good idea. That's a good idea. Thank you so much. Okay, there we go.
There you go. Perfect.
Okay, so let's get started. Good afternoon and welcome to everybody who's taking the time on this snowy day to take part in this webinar, and thank you. And also thanks to Sarah Pozzi and Michelle French and Stephen Gonzalez for helping to organize this session. I don't like doing Zooms anymore. I'm sick of them. I really feel like for this kind of a topic, it would be great if we could be together in the same room, look each other in the eye, shake hands. Again, particularly around this topic. But, it's a snowy day. So had this been in person, we might have had 10 people in the room anyway. I don't know. But at any rate, we will do the best we can, and I would just encourage people to be interactive as you want, when we get to the Q&A portion. So, I could talk a lot about this topic. I was thinking, man, how long do we have? I could write a book about this, and kind of being funny about it. I did write a book about it, as Sarah indicated. I wrote a book called Proving Ground, a memoir, and a lot of the things I'm going to be talking about, the details are there. It's a 488-page book, and we just can't in 40 minutes go into everything that we could deal with. But the other thing I want to say is just to get things straight from the beginning, I'm certainly not a DEI professional or a policymaker or anything like that. I have a lot of mixed feelings about the journey that I have and the things that I have experienced over the years. But I'm very acquainted with the issues of diversity and inclusion, and especially equity. And I want to just share some of my experiences and knowledge with you today, and to hear from you about what you think about some of these issues. So I'm going to start with a story, a family story, and I promise that there is a point to this that I'll be making in a few minutes. But I think it's very important to set the table when we're talking about these kinds of issues, and to kind of lay the groundwork. So I want to start out by showing you my great grandmother. Her name was Cassie, and she was born in 1824. She was a slave, in the house of this fellow by the name of Alexander. And so our relatives call her, I guess she called herself eventually Cassie Alexander. She was a housekeeper and a house manager for this Mr. Alexander. But at some point he impregnated her. And that was not uncommon during slavery for masters to consort with their slaves. And she bore a child out of that situation, and his name was Henry. And probably because of the difficulty that situation caused within his own family, Mr. Alexander packed up Cassie and her son, her infant son, and shipped them off to another slave master in Georgia, a fellow whose last name was Askew. And it was unusual for a slave to be sent to another plantation with their child. My family members think that perhaps Mr. Alexander felt guilty about what he had caused to happen. Maybe he had some feelings for Cassie, don't know. But he sent her off to this Askew plantation. Askew, in turn, caused Cassie to have 6 children. We could, I don't know if there is a term, again, I'm no expert, but when someone is a slave, you own them and you cause them to have children. I hate to use the word fathered children. And I know rape is a charged word, but he impregnated her probably many times, and she ended up having 6 children as a result of that. And eventually, well, let me back up for a second. There was a situation in the household with this Askew where, and again, my relatives, particularly one of my uncles, was fond of saying that this Askew fellow would have the slaves come into the house, the slave children of that he had fathered, and have them eat at the table after his family finished. He had a wife and children. He would have them into the house and they would eat at the table. He would say, "Bring the chappies in," after, the family was finished. And this caused a lot of consternation with his own family. But Cassie also eventually had the audacity to bear a child with another slave. And as a result of that transgression in the eyes of Askew, she was severely beaten. So eventually, emancipation came, 1863, and Cassie was able to leave the Askew plantation, and she took all of her children and left. She was offered provisions. She was offered supplies, wagons, this sort of thing. When she left, if she would take the name of Askew, and she refused to do so. So she moved to Mitchell County, Georgia, with less possessions than she probably could otherwise have. So as I say, Cassie had 6 children. One of her daughters was a woman by the name of Amy. And Amy was a midwife in Mitchell County, Georgia, in the area of Camilla. And again, my family members say that Amy delivered practically every child that was born in Mitchell County. Amy had a part in that birth. She was a popular midwife. And Amy eventually married her white, the fellow that she was keeping house for. She was a housekeeper. This fellow had been married a couple of times. He eventually married Amy. And they had a son by the name of Timothy Titus Catchings. The fellow Amy married, his last name was Catchings. And Timothy Titus Catchings became a very successful farmer in Camilla, Georgia. In fact, when I was a child, I visited the farm and we had family reunions on the farm. Timothy was dead by this time, but his eldest daughter was Elizabeth Bernice, and that's Elizabeth Bernice on the right side of the picture. She is my maternal grandmother. And Elizabeth Bernice married a fellow by the name of William Wise Hayden, and they moved to Flint, Michigan, immediately after World War I. William Wise Hayden had been a messenger for the United States Army in France during World War I. And they moved to Flint, and they started a dry cleaning store directly across the street from the Buick motor car factory. So that's how my family got to Flint, Michigan the first time. That's how we first became acquainted with Flint. It was after World War I. And, I know a lot of Black people of my generation have similar stories to tell. Those that know their history, the stories are almost identical. And so I'm going to fast forward 100 years from when Cassie left that plantation in Virginia bound for Georgia. Move forward 100 years, and we find that even 100 years later, segregation was still alive and well in the South and throughout the country. My parents lived in this environment in Georgia during those times. My father, though, went into the Army during World War II. That's my father on the left, and those are his discharge papers on the right. He served as a radio operator for the Army way out in the Aleutian Islands during World War II. And he had this love of radio and electronics. I don't know, because we never talked about it, I don't know if he acquired this love during his service in the Army or before his service in the Army, but this was a passion of his. And my mother, Claudia Louise Tarver, attended nursing school in Atlanta at Grady Memorial Hospital. But again, it was a segregated hospital system, and so she graduated from the Grady Colored School of Nursing. You can see that right under where it says Grady Memorial Hospital. But she got her degree in nursing. And so eventually they settled back into Albany, Georgia. My father was selling insurance for a Black-owned insurance company there, and my mother worked as a nurse at Phoebe Hospital in Albany, Georgia. And one night I think it was around 1947, my mother was working in the hospital, and this hospital was divided into a white side and a black side. And there was a hallway connecting the two sides. The white side was much more developed. The black side was kind of a ramshackle building, but there was a hallway connecting the two. And nurses would have to go back and forth in order to service all the patients. Well, my mother was near the connection between the two hospitals one night, and she had to pee. She had to use the bathroom. And she had to use it pretty badly, apparently, because she ducked into what was then a whites-only bathroom. And one of her coworkers saw her emerging from that bathroom and reported her, and she was severely reprimanded for that. And that was the point at which my mother and father decided to pull up stakes and themselves move to Flint, Michigan. So the point of all of this, the point of this little family history is that we have had diversity in this country for a long time, from the beginning. And we live in a country that's been more diverse than probably any other on earth. You know, when the original settlers came here, there were people on the beach waving at them, you know, the indigenous folks. We brought African slaves here against their will and subjugated them. And then we had people come from Europe and Africa and Asia, all around the world, willingly. But many times they struggle to find acceptance in this country. But in spite of all of that difficulty, diversity has been the source of our greatest strength. And it's the thing that has distanced us from practically every other country on earth. We're able to take advantage of this reality that we are all Homo sapiens and that talent is broadly distributed among Homo sapiens, despite differences in outward appearance. That's something that, you know, as a scientific person, or as rational people, we know. But on a societal level, in this country, diversity has happened, and it continues to happen. It's going to continue to happen. And inclusion and equity are the tools that enable us to harness that diversity for our benefit and to keep it from being something that is destructive. So here comes William David Tarver. In 1953, after my folks had moved to Flint, they had one more kid. I was born 6 years after my next sibling, my older brother. So I was born in 1953, and I lived a charmed life. You know, I don't like to admit that to my wife sometimes. I like to tell her how hard things were. But I lived a charmed life, especially in those early years. I had devoted, hardworking parents. I had a loving grandmother, Elizabeth Bernice, who I talked about before. She lived with us because her husband had passed away. And she came and lived with our family from that point, and she stayed with us till well after I graduated from college. So she was like another mother, and she was really a great source of inspiration and strength. So it's 1953, and let's look at what else was happening in 1953. The Detroit Lions were the 1953 world champions, you know, the National Football League champions. And you know, speaking of diversity, it's interesting to note that, you know, in those days, a lot of people didn't feel that Black people could play professional sports. This was an era in which this was a divided, segregated country. And you know, there were changes starting to happen. This is a picture of the University of Michigan football team from 1953, and you see one Black player there. So there was a teensy-weensy bit of diversity creeping in during the 1950s on the Michigan football squad. And you know, I think there was one or two players before that in earlier years, but the 1950s is when things started to change. And in Flint, you know, it's funny. I have students now. I talk about Flint sometimes. They have no conception of what Flint was. Even older people. Flint was an outstanding city in the 1950s. The automotive industry was really, you know, firing on all cylinders, to use a pun. This is a parade. I think it was for the 50 millionth Buick being produced. And it's a parade down the main street of Flint. You see the band behind the float with the car on the top and all this sort of thing. But, you know, Flint, basically, if you wanted a job, you had a job. in one of the automobile companies. And that wasn't all that was happening in the 1950s. In 1954, Brown versus Board of Education decision was handed down by the Supreme Court, and it outlawed discrimination in public schools. This was the picture you saw in response to some of that, to that Supreme Court decision and to some integration of the schools. A lot of people felt like, I don't care what the Supreme Court says, we're not going to go to school with Black people. And so as a kid growing up in Flint, I was hardened by the changes, but this was some of the change that I saw, this backlash, this feeling that, no, we're not going to integrate with these people. So as we move into the 1960s, again, amazingly, nowadays, to think about the fact that Flint had the second highest per capita income in the United States. Flint had a thriving Black middle class. And growing up there, I felt the pull of three powerful movements that drove the rest of my career. One of them was the civil rights movement. I sat there every day as a 9, 10-year-old, 11-year-old, seeing on TV the marches that were taking place and the news accounts of the progress that was being made and the backlash against that progress. So that was one of the waves that was occurring during the 1960s. Another, again, was this tremendous manufacturing machine in Flint, where that was just cranking out automobiles. You could go down by the railroad tracks and you'd see car after car after car, railroad car loaded with brand new Buicks or Chevys, leaving Flint. And you could see that the business model was cars go out, money comes in, and that was fueling this really tremendous community. And then another movement that I became aware of because of my father's interest in electronics and his establishment of a little electronics workshop in the basement. By the way, my father was never able to find employment as an electrical person. He never went to school as an electrical engineer. Again, those times did not made it very difficult for that sort of thing to be a reality for him. So he did it in the basement. And because he did it in the basement, I became familiar with things at a young age that I might not have become familiar with otherwise. And one of those things is down in the bottom right-hand corner there, the invention of the transistor at a place called Bell Laboratories. The transistor was just being commercialized in the mid to late 50s and the early 60s, and we had them in our basement, and I had experience with those devices from the time I was 10 years old. So we had a lot of positive things going on and a lot of positive movement happening during those days. And then going to the mid 60s, finally, we saw some signs of equity as a society. We saw some signs of equity. In 1964, Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, which outlawed discrimination in public accommodations. That was a huge, monumental achievement. And there's Lyndon Johnson handing one of the pens to Martin Luther King. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act was passed, which gave Black folks throughout the country access to the franchise of voting, where they had been precluded from doing so before by a number of measures. So this was real progress. And then in Flint, we saw evidence of some of this product. Flint elected the first Black mayor of a major city in the United States in 1966, the first one. And in 1967, Flint passed the first in the nation open housing law. Previous to this, people could restrict where people could live in a city based on their race. There were restrictive covenants written right into deeds that restricted who could own a particular home. And all that was laid to rest in Flint in 1967. So all of a sudden, you had a situation where everyone in Flint who had a job was middle class, right? Blacks and whites basically had the same resources. Now they could live in any neighborhood and afford any home. That was a huge change. And as I'll show later, that was also the beginning of Flint's demise, in my opinion. But it was real tangible change, and it was an attempt to move toward equity. Of course, there were some dark clouds on the horizon in the 1960s and some really terrible events. This picture depicts the murder of Dr. Martin Luther King in 1968. He and Robert F. Kennedy were killed within 2 months of each other in 1968. Before that, John F. Kennedy was killed in 1963. I was 10 years old in the 5th grade. It was a devastating happening. Malcolm X was killed in 1965. In 1967, there were riots in LA in 65, but then in Detroit in 1967, a huge riot. Vietnam War protests. The country often seemed in turmoil. And again, you can imagine for a young person growing up that this could be a problem. But I saw the progress. I was encouraged. I think a lot of my colleagues, a lot of my contemporaries, my friends, we saw these changes occurring. We saw it as a fight that we were winning, right? We thought that we were young and gifted and Black, and that we were going to go out and do great things and continue this progress that we were seeing in the world. And so graduating from high school, and by the way, this picture is from the 1971 Flint Area Science Fair, where I was a finalist all 4 years of high school in the Flint Area Science Fair. This is the high school, the senior year occurrence of my participation there. And I look very upset in this picture, despite holding a big trophy, because they changed the rules that year to keep me from going to the National Science Fair. That's another story. It's in the book. But at any rate, I was undaunted because I knew 2 things. I was going to get an electrical engineering degree. I was going to start my own electronics company. So, I call the next period kind of trailblazing time, and a lot of Black folks recognize this period. A lot of times we say, it was a period that was replete with the first Black this and the first Black that, or in those days we might even say the first Negro. But it was trailblazing time, and so I was among the first Blacks to attend Kettering University. It was then called General Motors Institute, in any significant numbers. Again, there was 1 or 2 or 3 here or there for several years before that, but I think in our class in 1971 we had like 40 Black students, which was something. And I was among the first Blacks to attend the University of Michigan College of Engineering in any significant numbers. Again, there were smatterings here and there before, but in terms of any significant numbers, this started in, the early 70s. And in terms of the environment at University of Michigan and even the policies, I think it's useful to compare and contrast how things are now with how things were then. There were professors who were openly hostile in those days, unwelcoming to Black students, and I've heard students from other backgrounds indicate that, professor didn't like you, you were screwed. I had one professor, and I wrote about this in my memoir, attempted to cheat me out of an A in a class, and I was able to document and substantiate this cheating of me and got the grade changed. And I had another situation where a professor, I had an A- going into the final exam. The class was linear algebra. And the professor, after the final, refused to show me my final or tell me what grade he just told me you're getting a B in the class. And, so I had situations like this occur on several occasions at University of Michigan. And it strikes me that I don't think this stuff would fly at the University of Michigan today. I mean, I'm teaching now. We have teaching evaluations. We've got rubrics that we put in place for every quiz, every homework assignment, every exam. I don't think that this kind of thing would occur at University of Michigan today, but I would be interested to hear from students today to substantiate and to validate that the environment is better. We have a Center for Research on Learning and Teaching that focuses on inclusive teaching. So I would hope that, these kinds of things don't occur. Maybe there are other mechanisms that students respond to. But I had another professor in the College of Engineering who happened to be the first Black professor in the college. And I was taking an electronics class from him, and I considered it an insult if I got anything other than an A or an A+ in any electronics class. Well, I got my grade and I got a B+ from this professor, which, was a B, but it was a B+. And of course, I was upset, like I was in other cases where I thought I deserved a better grade. So I rang up this professor and, I really want to follow up on how was it that I got this B+ in your class? Come on in. He invited me in, and we sat down, office hour, sat down next to the desk. He opened the grade book. He showed me my exam. He showed me what I got, what other people got. He told me, you got the highest B+ in this class. And it was the highest B+. It was a little distance. It was some distance from the lowest A. And I said, okay, that professor and I became friends. And we are friends to this day because I respected his openness. I respected his integrity. And he taught me an important lesson that day, that no matter how good I thought I was, I had to work my tail off. And I took 2 more courses from him. I got an A in one, an A+ in another one. But I respected him because it would have been easy for him to say, here's a Black guy in my class. He's the highest B+. Let me just slide him up to A-. He didn't do that. And that integrity I contrast that with the experience I had with some of the other professors there. So in spite of the difficulties that Black students had in those days, and they were many, there were some good things too. For one thing, tuition was affordable, and minority students in particular had a strong support system in the dean's office that was brought about by a woman by the name of Ann Monterio. Ann ran something called the Minority Engineering Projects Office. And that office was charged with helping to ensure the success of these new students from underrepresented communities, Black students primarily, who were coming into the College of Engineering in those days. And Ann and I have remained friends, as she has with so many other Black alums over the years. I saw Ann a few weeks ago. She lives in Las Vegas now, and she's quite a bit older than those days, but we got together. We had a great time, and we always have a great time when we get together. And I so much respect what she did. Leo McAfee was that first Black professor in the College of Engineering. And as I say, he and I remain friends to this day. After University of Michigan, I was fortunate to land a job at AT&T Bell Laboratories. It was called Bell Labs in those days. Again, remember, that was the place where the transistor was invented. It was, I call it Mecca for engineers. It was the place where any engineer or computer scientist would be so happy to work. And I got a job at that place. And some of you may recognize this building. This is the place where the streaming series Severance is based, where it's filmed. Some of it is filmed. And this is what is it, Lumon Industries or whatever in Severance. We worked in this building, and you can see how futuristic it is. It was an incredible place. But more importantly than the Severance connection, it was the employer of Claude Shannon, who is recognized as the father of communication theory. There is a bust of Claude Shannon that I'm always fond of showing students outside the EECS building. He's a Michigan grad, and something that Michigan can be quite proud of. As I said before, it's the birthplace of the transistor, the data modem, the communication satellite, the Unix operating system, the C programming language, all this stuff, this, cell phone technology, all this stuff came out of Bell Labs. And in this building, there were 6,000 of the smartest people I've ever seen. But Bell Labs also had some of the most progressive HR policies I've seen back then or since. So, for example, there was an active and effective, what we called affirmative action program in those days. There were active efforts to hire more Blacks and other minorities and women. In those days, it was rare to see Blacks. It was rare to see women in technical roles. It was not quite as rare to see Asians in technical roles, although it was rare. It was very rare to see them in management. And so there was an active effort at that time to change that situation, to introduce more equity into that corporate environment. And Bell Labs also expanded the list of schools that they recruited at to include the historically Black colleges and universities. They had a recruiting method. I participated on the recruiting team for Bell Labs back in the day, and we weren't just looking for the highest numeric grade that someone would score. We were looking at the whole person. So we wanted top tier performers, no doubt, but we were looking for other things as well. What kinds of contributions did this person want to make? What had they done tangibly in their career? What kind of projects had they done, and how did they do on those projects? Did they exhibit a hands-on familiarity with the field that they were looking to go into? So it was I think an effective recruiting strategy. We had something called an urban minorities workshop, which was really out there. It was in terms of being a kind of an avant-garde strategy, but it was a workshop at which white managers were introduced to what it was like to be from and to live in a community that was not like one they had come from, right? They had to get familiar with the issues and concerns of people who were not like them. And in those days, the workshop took place in Newark, New Jersey, and Newark was kind of a scary place in some areas during those days. But it was an effort to sensitize managers to what life was like on the outside, because Bell Labs and AT&T in those days was charged with serving everybody, providing telecommunication service to everybody, not just the elite. We had different speaker series at Bell Labs that were very informative and, addressed a broad audience. We had something called the Bell Labs Club, which was more than 100 activities, everything from softball to train sets to ham radio to you name it, funded by the company. And that facilitated employee connections on more levels. We had a one-year on-campus program at which Bell Labs would send people to get their master's degree in engineering and a doctoral support program. A lot of people were educated through those programs. So pretty progressive place. I left there after 7 years, and I'm going to scoot ahead because I want to leave time for questions, but I left there after 7 years, started a company in my basement with two of my buddies. We made telecommunications test gear, and the gear that we made was first a modem test system. Modems were the way people accessed data and accessed the internet in the early days. And then we made test systems for wireless transceivers for testing cell phones. And we sold these products all over the world, including in those days, one of our largest markets was in Japan. This was in 1987. I was giving a lecture on our products to Japanese engineers from some of the leading companies in Japan, Sony, Matsushita, Ricoh, all these different outfits were looking to up their game in this area so that they could ship more products to the US. We sold the company in 1995, and I won't say a lot more about that, but I then embarked on some social service projects, some community service projects, served on a lot of boards, a number of boards, started an education advocacy and development organization in the town of Red Bank, New Jersey. We had some tremendous impact in that school system there, and we had a lot of fun. These are some of the teachers in the Red Bank school system who it wasn't easy, but we managed to make progress. There was an article in New Jersey Magazine about this whole thing about, it called me a wealthy businessman turned reformer, and that didn't go too well with a lot of the people who were on the other side in town. Just being in New Jersey Magazine and then being called a wealthy businessman turned reformer, you have to be careful about your communication and your PR when you are doing community service work, and that didn't turn out quite the way I thought it might. Back to Flint, back to Michigan in 2007. My family and I moved to Michigan in 2007, and we saw a very different city from what we had come to know. So the population in Flint, this is the population graph of Flint, peaked in 1960 census, 2020 census. You can see it went from almost 200,000 to just about 80,000 in the 2020 census. Flint went from being one of the country's richest towns to one of the poorest. Automotive jobs went from 85,000 to under 10,000. The population dropped, as I mentioned. There was severe segregation and white flight that started during the 1960s. So this is the flip side of that equity, of that integration of the community that ended up being very negative for Flint. And so there was a lot of disinvestment. This is a similar situation in Detroit. Detroit's decline started actually after the 1950 census, but similar decline. This is that Buick City complex in the 1990s when it was being demolished. And then in 2016 or so, we had this water crisis severe water crisis that was revealed in Flint, it was the result of just a lot of this disinvestment, neglect, poverty that had taken hold in Flint. And so industry was gone, entrepreneurs gone, diversity gone, equity gone, inclusion. Who wants to be included in a situation like that? So, coming back here to Michigan, my feeling was, if we're so smart, I look around in Ann Arbor, I see all these great facilities, all these smart people, kind of like, my days at Bell Labs. But I'm constantly saying to myself, if we're so smart, how could this happen? How could our cities be like this? How could people suffer this way? What can we do? And so, inspired by what I have seen since returning to Michigan, I decided to focus my energy on facilitating entrepreneurial innovation to enhance the quality of life in urban communities. And not just Flint and Detroit and places like that, but 80% of the people in the United States live in an urban community. And the health of these communities is what's going to determine the health of our society and, of course, the health of our university. And so I started this organization called the Urban Entrepreneurship Initiative in 2014 to advocate for and facilitate more urban innovation to improve the quality of life in cities. And that effort has been supported from the beginning by the Center for Entrepreneurship here at Michigan. This picture is Miguel McKelvey, one of the co-founders of WeWork, and they've been in the news quite a bit the last couple of years, but he was our keynote speaker at our symposium in Detroit in 2015. And then with the support of Center for Entrepreneurship, I created this Urban Entrepreneurship Practicum course at the University of Michigan in 2015 to acquaint students with the challenges and opportunities attendant to urban innovation. And this is me and last fall's class on our tour of Detroit. We're in a very hospitable place called the Kebab House in Hamtramck. It's a very popular Bangladeshi hangout. So I'm closing up. I have some questions regarding future equity. What can we do in our organizations to counteract the kind of racism that leads to separation and disinvestment? What can we do? How can we leverage the considerable resources of the university to better identify and solve problems in communities that are different from ours? We have resources that enable us, that in fact focus on that area. In the College of Engineering, we have the Center for Socially Engaged Design that can help us get better at that kind of thing. I use those resources in my classes. How can we identify research and teaching opportunities that address the most at-risk populations in our society and prioritize the most urgent needs? And how can we facilitate greater inclusion and a better overall experience for students from core urban communities? How can we enhance their experience both inside and outside the classroom? So one final thing I want to say is that I talked about my mother before. This is a picture from 1996. After I sold my company, I endowed a full scholarship in the College of Engineering, and it's in the name of my parents, my mother and my father, who actually passed away during my first semester, at the beginning of my first semester as a student at Michigan. But I'm holding my mother on one side, and my pastor, Braxton Burgess, was holding her on the other side, and she's crying. She can barely get her words out. And I thought she was crying because she was just so proud and she was so happy that this scholarship was being established in her name. She later told me that she was crying because she realized, it hit her that day, how much more she could have done had things been different in her day. And she was just so sad about that. So I don't want people to experience that kind of sadness. And I think we should do everything we can, regardless of people's background, to try to, build an equitable organization, university, community, society. I'm going to leave with the organizers a few references. There's my book, Proving Ground, a Memoir, but also The Warmth of Other Suns, talks about the migration from the South. Demolition Means Progress, talks about what happened in Flint. How to Kill a City, Peter Moskowitz is a treatise on 4 different cities and how those cities were destroyed, cities across the country. The Idea Factory by John Gertner talks about the fabulous Bell Labs, and Assholes, a Theory tries to put a research framework on the term. So that's it, and I'm happy to answer any questions with the few minutes we have left.
Thank you so much, David. That was a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. Please enter your questions in the Q&A as we are beginning here, the Q&A portion of the talk. We have a few pre-submitted questions that the audience submitted. So I'd like to start with one question about how have you tackled different DEI perspective among staff, board members, customers, and others you may have encountered of different nationalities and backgrounds?
Yes. So one of the things that I believe strongly in, and it's something that comes from, I've learned in the community, is talking to people and trying to understand where they're coming from and what their issues are. And it goes both ways. I showed a picture of my presentation to these Japanese engineers in Tokyo back in 1987, and I was really concerned before making that presentation. And so I pulled my distributor aside, Japanese fellow, Minio Yamamoto, pulled him aside, and I said, Mr. Yamamoto, I'm really concerned that I don't think these folks have ever heard from a Black company owner before. I think maybe you're being optimistic about how they'll receive this information, how they'll receive me. And his response to me was, just tell them you're from Bell Labs, because he knew that part of my pedigree would be impressive to them. So I stressed that during my presentation. We sold many systems in Japan after that. And in some months, we sold more in Japan than we sold here. So I think that people of different nationalities, people want the same thing. They want to provide for their families. They want to be respected. They want to be treated fairly. And I try to find common ground with people, no matter what the background.
Makes sense. Thank you. And in your experience, as we are making our DEI efforts, are striving to really making the place more inclusive for everyone in our community. And we know that we've made some progress since the times that you were describing in your talk, but there is still a lot of work to be done. So I wonder, in your experience, what makes for the most effective DEI efforts?
Yeah. It's probably easier in a startup company or a small company than it is in a university, because in a startup company, it's very easy to focus people on the objective, what it is you're trying to achieve. And in a university, it can be a little bit more, somewhat more nebulous. But one of the strategies we employed from the very beginning that was really unusual for a company like ours, we utilize the services of a professional organization development expert. It was somebody who we had met at Bell Labs, who ended up leaving Bell Labs and starting his own practice around the same time that we left. And we used him from the beginning to the end. So we would do things like, on a regular basis, bring our management team together and look at our practices and our role and responsibility breakdown, and we would bring employees in, the entire group of employees, and we'd have them first of all, we would assure them that there was no retribution for anything that they would say in those sessions, and we would encourage people to get everything out on the table and issues that they had. And it really made a difference having professional facilitation for that kind of thing. But that was something that helped in our case.
Great, great. There's a question a lot from the live audience here about when you sold your company, and they're asking, was it rewarding because of its success, or was it bittersweet for you? How was that process?
Yes, it was very rewarding. And I say to people that I didn't start the company expecting that I was going to get rich. I started the company because I wanted to see if it could be done. Coming out of the 60s, there wasn't a track record. There wasn't a record of Black folk going in the basement starting tech companies, right? And so I wasn't sure that this could be done. My father, had he wanted to do what we did, he couldn't have stayed in some of the hotels we stayed in because of segregation, right? But we were able to sell all over the country and all over the world. We sold our products in 25 countries. And so just getting the answer to that question was satisfying to me, that yes, we can do this, we can make it work. And we had no outside financing when we started this company. This was a bootstrap operation. And so I just felt so rewarded to be able to answer the question and to get the results of that experiment. Yes, this is something that we can do. And my co-founders stayed with the parent company for some years and did quite well. And I think in 2013, we still had the same basic product line. We had acquired some other things along the way, but our basic company, that division, crossed $1 billion in sales in 2013. And so we delivered tremendous value to the buyer. It wasn't a flash in the pan kind of situation.
Wow, that's amazing. Last question, also from the live audience. How can the institution overcome the inherent social economic selections that occur due to cost, which limits the diversity representation of those from lower incomes? Could you speak a little bit to that?
I'm trying to make sure I fully understand this question. I
believe it has to do with the institution in terms of like university and the cost of attending the university, and how can we really include everyone in our institution.
So I had I actually cut this talk down a lot because you can see it ran longer than I thought it was going to run anyway. It could have run for 3 hours, but one of the things that I wanted to stress is that the whole my whole point about what organizations can do, what the university can do, and the work that I'm trying to do now is a function of where do we spend our resources? We can say that we want to achieve this and this and this, but if we don't spend our resources in that area, we're not going to achieve results. So one of the things that I'm trying to encourage is that let's look at those populations that have the greatest need. In Flint, people need jobs, right? But we can also think in terms of the design of these communities. We have a school of urban design, right, at University of Michigan. Can we redesign these communities to make them more attractive to people and more livable for people, even though they're in northern climes? We have cities in the Netherlands and places like that people thrive, right, even though they're colder environments than Michigan is. But we haven't designed our cities. We designed our cities in the 1920s to the 1950s to assemble a bunch of people and build cars, right? And now we need to think about how can we redesign those cities. So we have to think from the bottom up and the top down. How can we use our expertise to benefit the places where these disadvantaged people come from. And I think in the process of doing that, we will attract more people from those communities to the university, because they'll see, wow, these people are really trying to uplift the community I'm from. They'll be inspired, they'll be motivated to do more. And I think it's a complex issue, and the solutions, it takes more than 2 minutes to get into.
Yes,
but I think it's doable.
Absolutely. David, I want to thank you again. It's been a pleasure hosting you today. Thank you for sharing your journey and for this very inspirational talk.
Well, thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure doing it. And now I have to go get ready for my class tonight.
Good luck with your class.
Thank you. Thank you.
Our
Thank you,
next
everybody, for taking part.
Yes. Our next lecture will be on March 7th. It will feature Lilia Cortina. We will send additional information to you via email, so watch your email for that. We hope to see you there.